Hello everyone, I'm John and welcome to this painting video, and in this one we're going to be doing a Marauder Bomber for Aeronautica Imperialis. Now again, as always with these videos, we're branded 3 colours up, so I always like to keep it simple and keep something that is table ready or something that looks good from that sort of typical 3 to 4 feet away from the table as you're moving stuff across the board. So this one focuses on a nice simple colour scheme, nothing too radical, but just adding some bits of high contrast in there to draw the eye to the miniature, and doing a few little bits that are a little time consuming in places. There's some panel lining going on, a little bit of highlighting and some weathering in there as well. So do let me know in the comments if you like what this is all about and you like the final result. But without any further ado, let's get stuck in. So to start off with, on our Marauder, I've basically built it all up and then sprayed it with grey cere. Not because we're going to be using contrast paints, but because I just like a grey primer. This sort of lovely grey primer lets me see everything, lets me see how good or how bad the spraying was. You know, if I do it in black, it's okay, but it's very hard to see all the details and stuff like that. So just a grey cere undercoat is fine for this particular model. Plus, it gives us a lighter base to work from and work up on. So we're going to start with our base color, which is going to be on the most of the upper surfaces of the aircraft, and underneath we're going to do a different color. So we're going to start with Castellan Green. I really love this color, one of my favorite base colors, particularly for doing anything Imperial Guard or anything like that. It's such a lovely color to work with. So we're just going to start painting all the upper surfaces, and at this point we don't need to worry too much about being neat, because we will be tidying it up with, you know, subsequent layers and subsequent other colors. So we're just going to give everything on the upper surfaces a couple of coats of this just to make sure it's down nice and tidily. So what I will do is I will explain the method here. So because I'm a big fan of Castellan Green, I have both the base and the air version of this paint. So we're going to be giving it a first layer with the base, and then I'm going to use Castellan Air to do layers over the top of it to smooth out my result. Because I'm not very good at thinning my paints, and I will fully admit that I'm not overly good at working that out with the brush. So yeah, I figured I may as well just cheat. I have the air color and I'm just going to put it down as layers over on top of this. So we're just going to go ahead, get a layer of this down, and then after that's dry, I'll put a layer of maybe 1 or 2 layers of the air. And then after that, when that's all dry, we'll come back and what you'll see is a completed base color of Castellan Green. With the Castellan Green down, I'm going to talk about real briefly how many layers or how many coats it's taken to achieve that finish. So we're looking at about 2 layers with the standard sort of base color, and then I just added 2 more quicker layers with the air paint version of Castellan Green, just to smooth it all out a little bit, and I think we have a pretty decent finish. So I'm happy with that. You can see there's areas I've missed or not done right, but that's okay. I already know they're going to be different colors. So at this point, we may as well work on the underside. Now, the underside as a grey already looks fine, so we're going to select another grey. And for that grey, we're going to go with Vallejo Game Color Ghost Grey. So it's very similar to the grey cere that we already have down there, but it might be a slightly different tone. It might have a touch more blue to it. So I'm going to put some on my palette, and it's probably going to pop out of the bottle, I just noticed. So we'll pour a little bit of that out. And yeah, let's just see what it is. It's definitely a bit more blue than the grey cere, I think. So what we're going to be doing with this step is defining the edges where we want the grey to be in comparison to where the green is. So what we're really going to do is just use the model to our advantage and just take this line in the fuselage and just use that as the cutoff point. So we're just going to very carefully take the brush along there. And again, we can always tidy this up with a bit of Castellan green afterwards if we think we've gone over or we don't like the line that we've done. Now, you don't have to worry about it being a perfect line either. You know, sort of, I'm just roughly following that curvature there, and I'll just take it right to the end like that. So when we're looking at it side on, we get a little bit of a hint of that underside color, which will also be present on the nacelles for the engines. And the bombs will go a different color later on. I think we're going to go as very sort of World War II-esque sort of OD green with maybe a yellow nose or something like that on them. Make them look like sort of older style bombs. So this step is all about getting a good couple of layers of this ghost grey down, just to give us a nice crisp sort of light color underneath the belly. And we'll do this until we're happy with it, and then we'll come back and start looking at picking out a few other colors, mainly the mechanical stuff around the ends of the engines, the intakes. We'll get some metallic work done on the top and over the sides and stuff like that. So we'll focus on the belly color now with the ghost grey, and then when we come back we'll start looking at what other colors we need to add. So with the ghost grey now down, we can have a look at the underside, and bar a little bit of cleanup here and there, it's gone down fairly well. Maybe a bit thin in places, but I'm not too worried about that. I have a feeling I'm going to be shading that a little bit later on and making it look a bit more interesting. So in the meantime, we're going to move on to some metallic details, and for the base coat of that we're going to be going with lead belcher, as creative and out of the box as that is. So pardon me, we're going to be base coating the engine intakes up to here as well. So let me tilt them over a little bit on the base. So we'll be doing all this area, all the vent and everything that continues down and underneath it. We're doing that on all four engines. We'll also be base coating the weapons, so the two LAS at the front and the four heavy bolters. We'll be taking in some details back here, so probably these will go silver. And these are actually, I'm probably going to do in Retributor armor, these sort of heat sinky vent sort of feeling pieces here, as well as these cables and stuff like that. So again, another base coating step, nothing too fancy. We'll just get on with that, and when we come back we'll look at shading those metal parts and maybe adding some shade to the underside as well. With the silver all down, we're going to have a brief look at what we've covered. So all the engine intakes, the vents in there, I've managed to get a little bit of the lead belcher into them as well. We've got the guns done, we've got a few pieces of cabling and detailing, and yeah, just a few odd bits and pieces all over, a few bits underneath as well, just to break up that grey that we have going on. So at this point I'm going to wash these parts down, and we're simply going to use Nuln Oil for that, except for the cannons, the weapons. We're going to be using, let me see, I'll just pick it out of the shelf behind me here. We're going to be using Black Templar on the weapons. That's because I want them to look a little more solid and a little less bare metal than everything else. So they're going to get some Black Templar, and then when we highlight our silvers, the muzzles will be done in the a brighter silver. So that's the stage now. We're just going to start applying the Nuln Oil. So let's just work into the engine intakes first. And this just gives us this nice sense of depth and weight to those parts, because as much as this is an aircraft, it's an Imperial aircraft, so it's probably not very light. It's probably quite a chunky thing to fly. So yeah, it needs to have a sense of presence about it. And I know from my own Aeronautica collection, this is a similar scheme to what I went with on my Marauders, and I just really enjoyed how this looked, you know, a lot more industrial metal showing and stuff like that, with this little bit of shading and highlighting being done. It really does add to the effect. It really does give that proper sense of depth and weight to the parts. And we'll even get some into these vents here as well, just to give them a sense of that depth and shadow. And the little ones up here just behind the cockpit. Just up there, and there's probably a little bit too much wash in there, but that's fine. So we'll continue on with this, and then we'll put the Black Templar on, just onto the weapons, and then when we come back we'll see what that looks like, and then we can just move on with our next colours. So with the wash and the contrast paint down, we're starting to see this thing taking a good bit of shape. So there's a couple of little steps I want to do first, which first off is a little bit of a dry brush for some highlighting on the green. And for that, we're going to be using this Citadel base Deathworld Forest. It's a nice step up from the Castellan green. We're going to be using a larger dry brush for this, or a medium dry brush, Citadel one. But we're going to try and just focus on the edges, so it's not going to be quite like a dry brush, but what we want is a sharp edge on anything we want to highlight. So for example, let's start on the edge of the wings, and all we want to do is sort of just see if we can get a bit of color onto those edges a little bit, or even if we take a bit more paint off the brush, sort of just work it along there a little bit. Just all we're trying to aim for here is a bit of highlighting and a bit of defining of edges. So we're doing a little bit on the wings, do a little bit on the top of the engine nacelles as well. Now this is probably a step where you can either hard edge or dry brush. So in reality, if you're really going to go full out dry brush, you would probably do this before any other step, which is fine. But all I'm looking for here is just a bit of edge defining detail, a little bit of highlighting. More so on the upper surfaces. You see that we're getting that across the nose there a little bit. Again, not trying to go over the top with this, we just want a little bit, almost like a little bit of a glint off the fuselage, you know, just picking up on some of the sharper edges. So really not much there, just a little bit of edging here and there, just nothing too groundbreaking here, guys. We're not going to push the boat out too much. Again, we want each of these steps to be quick, because again, remember, we're aiming for sort of table ready here. Now I know this is probably already pretty decent, but it never hurts to go a little bit extra on some details you would really like to pick out. Because at this scale of miniature as well, you really want to make sure that the details that are there are visible. You want the shape to be more defined. You want the edges to be quite defined, because as an aircraft model, particularly when you're painting it in a sort of a drab scheme, it's really not that easy to pick out the details that you want. So I think that will do it for our green. And what we'll move on to now is a metallic dry brush for everything we just washed. So we're going to move on to NECRON Compound for that. Again, same dry brush. I'm going to just prepare our brush. In fact, we'll change brush. I think we'll use a smaller brush for this. So we'll get in there, and what we're looking to do is just hit the front of these engine intakes. Bit like that. So it just brings them up a little bit, not too much. And then onto guns. This will probably show up a lot more on the weapons because of the Black Templar paint on them first. And that gives us quite a nice heavier looking metallic feel rather than the aircraft metals, like the actual aircraft metals, which feel a bit lighter. These weapons feel a lot heavier, you know, because they are, to all intents and purposes, a standard las cannon or a standard heavy bolter that you find anywhere else. So having that change of appearance between a weapon metal and a aircraft metal does help a little bit with the contrast that we're aiming for. You know, just the ubiquitous heavy bolters and las cannons that have been slung onto these great big flying machines. I'm also going to touch the engine exhausts a little bit here as well, just to bring them up too. Now at this point we can also work at a little bit of paint chipping. Not too much, again, we're just trying to get a little bit of detail in here and there. So taking the dry brush again, and all I'm going to do is tap it along the edges, like mostly on the leading edges and the edges of the wings, around some of these vents and stuff like that. And this does more work for you than the dry brush with the Death World Forest. This starts to add a little bit more realism to them. Yeah, the paint has been flaking off over usage, you know, so many hours of flying time. This sort of happens to planes. You know, if you ever look at pictures of Spitfires and bombers back from World War II, you see a lot of this sort of this aircraft metal showing through the paint, where the paint has just chipped off over time through weathering. What we can also do is on the top of the plane, we can do some little swipes. And what that helps to do is to highlight a few other pieces and increase that sort of paint chipped sort of look to it. And then we'll also run the dry brush just tapping again along the edges of the fuselage. Just in certain spots, just to increase a little bit more paint chipping going on there, here and there. So we're going to shift gears now and we're going to move on to the underside. We're going to revisit that, and I'm going to use another contrast paint, and this one it's going to be Gryph-Charger Grey. And what we're planning to do with that is to keep it thin and just apply a very light coat over the whole thing. So with a bit of water mixed into the contrast paint, I think a little bit more than that might help. It's going to be quite weird looking, but what we're aiming for here is just to get a bit of shading underneath the plane. And we'll revisit the top later. We're just trying to get a colour down here to shade that doesn't make the whole model look just muddy and nasty. So we wouldn't be doing anything like a Nuln Oil or anything like that, because it's too far removed from the colour that we have down here as a base colour, and it would just look messy. So a slight bluey grey is definitely a far more aesthetic option. It's going to shade a bit more realistically than using a Nuln Oil or anything like that. It's also not going to show up too much if we stray into the green. It's just going to settle quite nicely and give us a little bit of something underneath. So there's not much really else to say about the underside of the plane. We're not too concerned about that because you're very rarely going to see much of the underside. So the next step would be, well, what do we want it to be? Let's do a little bit of further weathering on the back here. Because I always like to think that these are sort of exhaust ports for something. Now, talking historical, on a B-17 bomber, you would have seen trails of soot or oil or something out the back of the engine nacelles. That would have usually been off the supercharger, but it's usually mounted underneath. But I think there is some exhaust vents that come out onto the top of the wings near the back, and they always have like nice little trails off of them. So what we're going to do here is take a little bit of Agrax Earthshade, and what we'll do, or how we do this, is start with a pull of it around the area we want, and then we're going to just swipe it back like that, and what we're doing is just creating a little stripe of variation of color here, just to represent these parts of the engine's venting something, you know, whether it's heat damage on the paint from just the heat being released from those parts of the engines. It makes a bit more of a visual interest and starts to lean into that realistic sort of look. And I think the more realistic effect you put on to something that's completely based in fiction, the more realistic, the more believable the piece ends up being. So if you're doing little things like heat damage on paint from engine exhausts or heat vents or something like that, the more interesting the machine will look in general. So that's quite a subtle finish, or it will be quite a subtle finish when it dries, which is absolutely fine. Now, we're not going to get rid of the Agrax just yet, because we're also going to be using some Retributor armor now. So we're going to take some Retributor armor, and we're going to paint what I was talking about earlier, these sections here, which feel to me like a sort of a heat sink sort of thing. Because these are meant to be big turbofans or something like that, and I'm sure the electronic systems and stuff on board one of these things in the 41st or 42nd millennium probably generates a fair amount of heat. So it would be fair to say you could have a few heat sinks on this thing, and it gives us an excuse to make another interesting detail. So, and again, it's something I did on my own Aeronautica collection. I added just a little few details in in some brighter colors, which just generally made them look a bit more interesting. And I think having a gold or a brassy color on something that's painted quite drab like this is definitely adds something to it. Now, it can be good or bad. You might think this is a mistake, and that's fine. You are free to paint your miniatures however you like, but I quite like how this looks. It's still leaning into that World War II sort of coloration. Like, you'll see brass next to olive drab stuff all the time. So I think it plays into that rather well. Now, once that's dry, that will also get a coat of Agrax Earthshade just to tie it down. The next step we're going to do is, if I have any here, do I have any black ink, for example? I think I have some old black shade up here. So I'm going to take some Vallejo. It is Vallejo, trust me. Black shade. This is a Flames of War color. I've had this for years. And we're going to do something that many people would tell me I don't have the patience for. And they're generally right. But we're going to do some panel lining. And this is why I'm trying to keep most of the paint I apply fairly clean, because we're not going to be doing a lot of over washes. Like, we're not going to be washing over this green. We are going to be panel lining though. And it's just a matter of taking this black ink and just working it into these panel lines. Then we can just wipe it away, and we start to get a real good solid definition of the depth of detail. And what we can do is just wipe the excess away, and if any of it streaks across the wing, that's also a little bit of a win, because then we get another stain, another random stain on the miniature. So this is a time-consuming process, but I think when you see it all done across the entire model, I think you're going to find that you're going to agree with me and say that it's a detail that's worth doing. So also, while we're off doing that, I'm going to take some grey cere, so just plain ordinary grey cere, and we're going to paint in all the canopy windows and the what do they call them, armor crests on the turrets. So we'll do all that, and then when we come back we can start looking at colouring them in as well. So what we've done is paint grey cere into the canopy windows, all the armoured glass. We've put the Agrax Earthshade onto these brass parts here, and we've done all the panel lining. Now the panel lining does look pretty damn decent. Like, it gives you that extra definition that you want from the miniature, so that even from a little bit further off, or from what would be a standard gaming distance, that's still going to be a detail that's apparent. And that's what we're trying to aim for with keeping things simple and clean, and you know, trying to do it as quickly as possible within reason. I think Aeronautica models in particular, because of their scale, kind of demand a little bit more attention when it comes to doing details and stuff like that. So we're going to go on to our last step, basically, before we do a matte varnish over it, stick it on its proper flying base, and then we'll display the miniature to you completely finished. I want to do the canopy colours, and I want to do a couple of there's a couple of searchlights here on the front I want to do as well. My own Aeronautica, I did the cockpit canopies blue, and it was nice and striking, but at the same time I'm kind of looking for something a bit different. So we've got all these dark greens, and we've got this brass, which is all sort of muted, but we want to go on to something a bit brighter. So I think this time around, what I'm going to do with the cockpit, the canopy windows, is Spirit Stone Red. I think this could be quite interesting, quite bright. Before we do that, I also have to mention I painted the bombs underneath the wings. Again, that's another way of getting a bit more detail and a bit more contrast out there. These have been painted simply with Death World Forest, followed by a Nuln Oil wash. That's it. We're not going to do much more to them than that, I think. We can always go back at a later stage if you want to revisit your collection, do a bit of yellow detailing on the noses, or anything like that. It's entirely up to you. We're just going to try and cover the basics, get as much down as we can in the quickest in the quickest time possible. So we're going to try red canopies and red armor glass this time, and I think with the grey cere as the base, these should retain a nice bright finish, but hopefully not too bright. We could always have done this in black or something as well, but let's just see what happens. I think it could be quite interesting looking. Definitely aiming for that higher contrast finish. And what's great about these technical paints is they just sit in there like a gel and don't really go anywhere. So I'd say at the end here, you'll be able to tell me if you like this or not. And I think I'll be able to tell at the end if I like it or not. But I think just to have something about the miniature that really makes the colours pop, sort of draws your attention before you see further. You might see these canopy colours before you see the rest of the aircraft, which is fine in my opinion. Do that. I think that's going to be quite an interesting look, because as that's drying with the grey cere underneath, it's looking a little more orange than it is just straight up red. So we'll go off and we'll do the rest of that in a minute or two. We're going to take some Soulstone Blue, and what we're going to use that on is there's a couple of searchlights here on the front, just to add, again, more coloration, get some details that when you start to look closer at the miniature, some of these details start to become apparent as well. So it's just a matter of getting the soulstone blue and just putting a dab of it onto each of these at the front. Now we could have had them lit up, but just decided not to, pretty much. So we have some optics down here as well. We can dab a little bit on there. And this is just a real quick way of doing a real quick detail pass to sort of say, yes, I did pay attention. Yes, I know these things are going to be different colors, so let's just do it anyway. So it just adds something more to the front of the aircraft and on the tail. But what we'll do now is move on with the rest of the Spirit Stone Red, do the rest of the canopies, the rest of the armor glass. We'll give it all a matte varnish, put it on its proper flight stand, and then we'll get to see the miniature completely finished, bar transfers, which of course you can do at your leisure. With all the armor glass now covered and the matte varnish applied all over the miniature, we now have our finished Marauder Bomber. So what do we think? You can let me know in the comments. What I think is, if we had a few more details in there, like transfers down and stuff like that, which we haven't done in this video, we would have a very nice completed piece. As we have it right now, we have plenty of detail to look at, a lot of visual interest, the red canopy windows and stuff. I'm a bit hit or miss with. You guys can let me know in the comments if you like that or not. I think it does add a very striking colour to it. So if it's sitting on a table and someone's walking past, I think the red is very eye-catching. So in general, I think we have a very solid looking bomber, and I quite like the look of it. I think if you had 2 or 3, maybe even 4 of these things down on the table flying around doing all their maneuvers and stuff, I think it would be very aesthetic and very enjoyable to watch and to play. So as always, guys, please let me know in the comments what you think of all this, and until next time, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay safe, and I will see you again very soon.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now, and while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.